10 billion Swiss francs a year, over 10 billion euros, and not a single shareholder to answer to, not a single owner to pay dividends to, meaning the share of profits that normally goes to whoever puts up the money. That's how Rolex works. A company that single-handedly makes more revenue than Cartier, Omega, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Richard Mille combined, but that officially has no owner. Because Rolex, the most recognized watch brand on the planet, belongs entirely to a charitable foundation, a non-profit organization whose official purpose is charity. And it's been doing it since 1945.
Let that sink in. A charitable organization that controls one of the most profitable businesses in the world without paying corporate taxes. The system behind this is one of the smartest strategies ever created.
And the most unsettling part isn't that it exists. It's that it was designed this way on purpose, almost a century ago by a single man. A German orphan who arrived in London with nothing and built an empire that no one, not even he himself, could ever buy or sell. Why would anyone do that? What system did this man discover that the rest of the luxury world still doesn't understand? Hans Wilsdorf is born in 1881 in Kulmbach, a small town in Bavaria, the southern region of Germany. And from a young age, life hits him with blows that would make anyone give up. His mother dies when he's a child. His father, shortly after, when Hans is barely 12 years old. The uncles who take charge of Hans, his brother and his sister, do what many would. They sell the family business, an iron tools factory that had been in the family for generations, and send the 3 children off to boarding schools. But Wilsdorf doesn't come out of those boarding schools as a broken orphan. He comes out as someone who understands something most people don't understand until it's too late. That if you don't have family to back you up, you need to build something that doesn't depend on anyone. And that obsession, the drive to create something indestructible, is what defines every decision he makes from that point on. At 19, he lands a job at a watchmaking firm in La Chaux-de-Fonds, the epicenter of the Swiss watch industry, and there he discovers something that fascinates him, a product that everyone needs, that combines mechanical precision with craftsmanship, and that still doesn't have a clear market leader. 5 years later, in 1905, at 24 years old, Wilsdorf settles in London and founds a company with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis, Wilsdorf and Davis, dedicated to importing Swiss watch movements and fitting them into English cases. The business works, but Wilsdorf sees something no one else sees, that the future isn't in pocket watches, those timepieces men carry chained inside their vest, but in wristwatches, which at the time are considered a feminine accessory that no serious man would wear. In 1908, he registers a new brand for those wristwatches, Rolex. A short name, easy to pronounce in any language, and one that, as he himself said years later, looks good on a watch dial. The bet is risky because the watchmaking world sees wristwatches as toys, inaccurate, fragile, not serious. And this is where Wilsdorf makes his first masterstroke. Instead of trying to convince people with advertising, he decides to let the data speak for itself. In 1914, he gets a Rolex wristwatch to obtain the Class A certificate from the Kew Observatory, a precision test so demanding that until then only marine chronometers had passed it, those enormous clocks that ships used for navigation. It's the first time in history that a wristwatch receives that distinction, and Wilsdorf makes sure the whole world knows about it.
See the strategy. He's not trying to sell watches Mattias, he's selling something much bigger. He's trying to change the perception of what a wristwatch is. First, he legitimizes it with data no one can argue with, and then he lets the market come to him.
And it works. When World War I breaks out that same year, soldiers in the trenches discover that a wristwatch is far more practical than pulling out a pocket watch while being shot at. And suddenly, what was a feminine accessory becomes an essential military tool. Wilsdorf didn't create that need, but he already had the product ready when it arrived. 5 years later, in 1919, Wilsdorf makes another decision that defines everything that follows. He moves the company from London to Geneva, Switzerland. Not for the Alps or the quality of life, but because Switzerland offers something no other country can guarantee with the same certainty: fiscal stability and political neutrality. A country that doesn't go to war, that doesn't change the rules every time there's a new government, and where money is safer than in a vault. Over the next 2 decades, Rolex becomes synonymous with technical innovation. In 1926, they launch the Oyster, the world's first hermetic watch, resistant to water and dust. 5 years later, in 1931, they invent the perpetual self-winding mechanism, which allows the watch to recharge itself just from the movement of the wrist. Each innovation reinforces the same idea. Rolex isn't a pretty watch. It's a watch that works where others fail. But in 1944, life deals Wilsdorf a blow he never fully recovers from. His wife, Florence, whom he married in 1911 in London and had been with for over 30 years, dies. They have no children. And it's at that moment, alone, with no heirs, 63 years old, and an empire in his hands, that Wilsdorf makes the strangest decision any businessman of his stature has ever made.
Anyone else would have sold, would have found a successor, would have gone public, would have put the company on the market so anyone could buy a piece of it. But Wilsdorf didn't want anyone to own a piece of Rolex. No one. Ever.
In 1945, he establishes the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation and transfers 100% of Rolex's ownership to this foundation. Under Swiss law, a charitable foundation has no shareholders, doesn't distribute profits, can't be bought or sold, and, here's the key, doesn't pay taxes on its earnings. So who's in charge then? A board of directors, a small group of people who makes all of Rolex's strategic decisions, oversees that profits are either reinvested in the company or donated to charitable causes. Executives earn salaries like at any other company, but no one can pocket the profits the way an owner would, because there is no owner. And the Swiss government monitors that foundations fulfill their purpose. If the people at the top went overboard with salaries, the law would come down on them. Currently, the foundation donates between 100 and 150 million francs a year to social causes. Wilsdorf has just created something that didn't exist before. A luxury company with no owner that generates billions, that can't be absorbed by any corporate group, that doesn't have to answer to impatient investors, and that has all the time in the world to do things its way. Because when there are no shareholders pressuring for quarterly results, you can think in decades instead of quarters. And that's exactly what Rolex has been doing ever since. But having all the time in the world and answering to no one has a dark side that very few dare to mention. Because what Rolex has built with its distribution system isn't exclusivity, it's absolute control. Rolex manufactures 1,200,000 units a year, more than Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Richard Mille produce combined in a decade. It sells every single one. Not a single watch sits in a warehouse. The problem is that there are far more people wanting to buy a Rolex than there are watches available. And Rolex knows it, but doesn't increase production to meet that demand. Result? If you try to buy one, you'll be put on a waiting list that can last years. The Submariner, one of their most popular models, has an average wait of 2 months. The Daytona between 3 and 5 years. How is it possible that the company that manufactures the most luxury watches in the world is also the one that makes them the hardest to buy?
Because the scarcity isn't in the production for an A-Keen. It's in the distribution. Rolex decides how many watches reach each store, when, and who gets to buy them.
And this is where the system gets ugly. Authorized dealers, the official stores that have Rolex's permission to sell their watches, don't operate with a normal queue. They operate with something called an interest list, which in practice means this. If you walk in asking for a Submariner with no purchase history, they'll tell you there's a waiting list. But if you first buy jewelry, a watch you don't want, or spend a few €1,000s at the store, suddenly your position on the list magically improves. It's a system where access is bought with more purchases. And Rolex officially doesn't acknowledge this happens, but does nothing to stop it either, because the system works for them. The harder it is to get a watch, the more people want one. And while Rolex controls every watch that leaves the factory, there's a parallel market that moves billions every year: counterfeits. Rolex is the most counterfeited brand in the world. An estimated 40 million fake watches are sold globally each year, and most of them imitate Rolex. Superfakes, counterfeits so sophisticated they fool even professional watchmakers, are a business generating over $1 billion annually. Entire factories in southern China are dedicated exclusively to copying Rolex models, and the best replicas already imitate even the internal movement of the watch, the hardest piece to fake. And here's the paradox. Every fake Rolex on someone's wrist reinforces the idea that Rolex is the watch everyone wants. Counterfeits don't destroy the brand, they feed it.
Think about it. What brand do you counterfeit? The one everyone desires. Every imitation is free advertising, reminding the world that Rolex is the standard of luxury.
But in 2020, something changes. The pandemic locks the world indoors. Interest rates, the price banks charge for lending money, are at historic lows. And suddenly there are millions of people with money they can't spend on travel or restaurants. And they discover that Rolex watches appreciate in value. A Daytona that costs $15,000 in store resells for $50,000 on the gray market, that circuit of middlemen who buy and sell watches outside of official stores. And the frenzy erupts. People who had never touched a watch start buying Rolex the way you'd buy stocks, meaning not to wear them, but to resell them at higher prices. Some take out loans to invest in watches. Social media pours gasoline on the fire. Videos of people buying a Daytona and flipping it for double in weeks go viral. And thousands of people who know nothing about watches jump in, thinking it's easy money. In March 2022, resale prices hit all-time highs. And then it collapses. Interest rates go up, easy money disappears, and prices drop 30% in months. Thousands of speculators are left trapped with watches worth less than what they paid.
An object designed to last generations became an asset as volatile as cryptocurrency. And the irony is that Rolex never wanted this to happen, and their own artificial scarcity created the perfect conditions for the bubble.
So now, what does all of this teach us?
First lesson: your legal structure can be your greatest competitive advantage.
Wilsdorf didn't create a foundation out of altruism. He created it because he understood that the worst threat to an empire doesn't come from the outside, but from within. Shareholders pressuring for short-term results, heirs selling to the highest bidder, executives prioritizing their bonus over the product. The foundation eliminated all of those threats in one stroke, and, as a bonus, ensured that Rolex wouldn't pay corporate taxes for 80 years. It's no coincidence that the most enduring brands in the world, Rolex, IKEA, Bosch, share similar foundation structures. When you don't have to explain yourself to investors every quarter, you can invest in quality with a 20-year horizon. And that, in the long run, is what separates brands that last from brands that disappear.
Second, don't sell the product. Then sell the access to the product.
Rolex discovered something the rest of the luxury industry took decades to understand: that a product you can easily buy will never be truly desired. Scarcity isn't a side effect of producing little. It's a deliberate strategy of producing a lot, but distributing with an eyedropper. The real business isn't the watch, it's the waiting list.
And third, when your product becomes an investment, you've lost control of your own story.
The 2020 to 2022 bubble proved that artificial scarcity is a double-edged sword. When resale prices exceed retail prices, the product stops being bought to be worn and starts being bought to be resold. And at that point, the brand no longer controls who wears its watch or why. Rolex went from being a symbol of personal achievement to being a casino chip.
Next time you see a Rolex on someone's wrist, ask yourself, did they buy it because they wanted a watch? Or because they wanted to belong to a club that doesn't exist? Because that's what Wilsdorf invented, an illusion that's been running for 80 years, and that no one will ever be able to break.